Thank you, Dr. Link. The world has plenty of potential renewable energy sources, but each has its own technical challenges. Scientists are working harder and harder to develop alternative energy sources that are sustainable, clean, and convenient. Studies in the UK show, just like you mentioned, in Europe could meet at least 80% of its energy needs from renewables by 2050. I don't know if this is viable, would you agree? But it is said so. So is renewable an alternative energy for the future? We'll leave the word to our distinguished guests for the answer. And we're going to start with Mr. Adel Baba Aissa. He is joining us from United Kingdom. He's the Director of Renewable Energy Partners.
Thank you very much, and also good afternoon, everyone. And I thank the organizers for allowing me to speak to you today on this very interesting panel, which is about alternative energy. And we heard a lot about natural gas and the role it has to play. And we've heard we heard from the previous speaker about obviously the role of all energies combining together. I think from our perspective as a renewable energy company that has been involved in the renewable energy production of electricity, there is no doubt that renewable energy has overcome its biggest challenge, which was and has been for many years the fact that it was a nice thing, great for the environment, but very expensive, and it couldn't survive without government help. Now, that is no longer the case. Low production costs for renewables are now a reality, and we have seen record low prices being reached in various locations around the world, Middle East, Africa, Asia, even in South America. And on various technologies as well. We're not only talking about PV being the most popular form of renewables, but we've also reached record low prices for wind and for concentrated solar power, CSP. And it seems like there isn't a month that goes by where we're not reaching a new record low price somewhere in the world. And what's quite clear today, if we're looking at this from a kilowatt hour basis, and we've had this discussion, the previous panels have mentioned this, about various costs, and it's sometimes unfair to compare costs, but if we look at this on a kilowatt hour basis, there's clearly a trend that shows that onshore wind is as competitive as gas, and solar PV is cheaper or more competitive than natural gas. That's a fact today. And surprisingly enough, it's in the same places where gas is produced, usually the Middle East, where we've reached these record low prices. And that's also because they have the highest irradiation. And so it is a trend that will keep on going. We don't know how far the prices of renewable energies will continue to drop, but just in the last 10 years, where I've been involved in the industry, there's been a price drop by 10. So as you were talking earlier, he said, yes, 20 to 30 cents. We're now talking about 2 cents. That's how far we've reached. And in terms of how renewable energy is a transition to a more sort of carbon-free and sustainable energy system, I think we need to also be aware of what's happening around the world and to look at what renewable energy has achieved and what has yet to achieve. It is quite clear that there has been an unprecedented drive and determination to push renewable energy, and that's been mainly driven by commitments to face climate change, and also access to concessional capital that's been made available by international organizations, international development banks, and international financial institutions. But the spread of this capital and these projects has been uneven. It has been going mainly to developed economies, where obviously there is a lot of power generation already. However, we are not necessarily putting it in the right places, like I said, because actually where the disproportionate effects of climate change are not going to be in the developed world, they're going to be in the developing world. And actually also the developing world suffers from this lack of access to power. So we have these two combinations: disproportionate effect of climate change in places like Africa, but also this is a continent that has the least amount of power. So there's clearly something wrong. And this is what our company tries to do. Us at Renewable Energy Partner, we focus exclusively on Africa and the Middle East, and we aim to bring power to business and communities within this region by producing clean, affordable power. And in places like Nigeria, Ghana, and Zambia, these are countries where we are active currently, this is a reality, because not only are we able to provide this power, but we're also able to do something much more important, which is displace diesel generation. Because in these countries, there is more capacity on diesel gensets than there are on the actual national grid. And this is how we with our limited means, are able to answer this alternative energy question. Thank you.
Thank you, Adel. Now we have Mr. Jeffrey Beyer. He's the founder and director of Beyonce Canada.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be a bit controversial on the panel as well, so please bear with me. I mean the most respect. I think in my experience, communication is only really possible if we have a shared understanding of reality. So let's just kind of go through a couple of points, I think, just to develop that shared reality. One thing is that we want a strong economy. Everyone wants a strong economy. What does that really mean? It means a good quality of life, health, security, safety, access to a good job. Okay, a strong economy is important. In Turkey, especially, the other thing we want that is going to lead to is increase in energy demand. It's true. Turkey has the lowest per capita energy consumption of the OECD. There's a high likelihood that Turkey needs more energy to satisfy its strong economy. The third kind of dimension is the planetary boundaries that we live in, right? Climate change is a real thing. We're rapidly approaching way more CO2 in the atmosphere than is manageable. So those three things, I think, are kind of my baseline for what reality is, right? They're three dimensions of the same reality. So recognizing that we have growing energy demand, a need to stay inside planetary boundaries, and an importance of a strong economy, how do we square those three dimensions of reality to achieve a future that we want? And that's where renewable energy comes in, right? You can't at one point have a growing demand of energy and satisfy that energy demand with a growth in fossil fuel consumption. Those two things are incompatible. So recognizing that, if we agree on those first three dimensions of reality, then we have to start looking at alternative energy. We heard a lot about gas today. I think gas is an interesting transition fuel. Ultimately, gas won't be able to be burned for energy production if we want to stay within planetary boundaries. We've talked about CCS. I feel like sometimes when you look at the cost of gas versus the cost of renewables, and then throw in CCS at the end of the conversation, we're failing to acknowledge the fact that CCS is actually very expensive. And the price of CCS is coming down. The opportunity for CCS in different parts of the world is fairly slim. So CCS as a bolt-on to a gas-fired power station, maybe, but let's see if the cost works out. And in my opinion, I mean, the price of solar, wind, geothermal is falling rapidly, and it's really going to make up a strong future. Energy independence and energy security is another enormous issue for every country, in particular Turkey. Turkey imports 98% of its gas. 98%. It's a risk. It's a huge risk. Why shoulder that risk when there are opportunities for renewable energy here in Turkey? Turkey's blessed with windy shores in the east and northeast. Turkey's blessed with sunny plains in the south and the wind is in the west, the sun is in the south and the east. There's geothermal across the country, enormous hydroelectric potential. Turkey has an abundance of renewable energy and a mix of renewable energy that allows it to tap into intermittent renewables like wind and solar by balancing those out with hydroelectric power, and geothermal is baseload. In my opinion, Turkey is an ideal case with the perfect geographies for a fully renewable future. If we're going to use gas, let's use gas for what it's good for: heat, industry, maybe mobility, okay? Gas for power, to me, isn't necessary. It's locking in 20, 30 years of ongoing emissions from a source that can be replaced competitively with renewable power. If we want to talk about cost, we have to talk about the envelope that we're drawing around this cost conversation. If it's a levelized cost of energy, fine, but that's a fairly narrow envelope. If we include the social cost of carbon, the effect of climate change, that massively outweighs costs in renewables' favor. If you're looking at subsidies, people often complain renewables get too many subsidies. Renewables got about $100 billion worth of subsidies last year. Fossil fuels got about $330 billion of subsidies last year. So the subsidy game doesn't fly with fossil fuels versus renewables. If you're talking about health, fossil fuels contribute to air pollution, respiratory damage, health, and premature death. Fossil fuels don't, or renewables don't. If we're looking at jobs, right? You have 2 times more jobs produced from renewable sources per $1 million of investment than you do from investment in fossil fuels. Not only that, but the location of renewable jobs is flexible. You can build a solar plant or a wind manufacturing facility in any province or in any region. You're forced to stick to certain locations when you're extracting fossil fuels. The flexibility of jobs for renewable energies is enormous. And of course, when you look at the environmental consequences of unbridled demand growth from fossil fuels, I mean, a large part of this conference is about refugees, and that's going to be an unfortunate and much more serious reality if climate change progresses in the projections that we're looking at. So for all of those reasons, costs, subsidies, health, jobs, energy security, the environment, technology costs, it's a winning hand, right? We're holding all the cards. All we need to do is implement them. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ling will need to leave us soon, so would you like to take this turn, sir?
Okay, I had obviously more slides than I showed, so I kept some cards up my sleeve. I think I don't disagree with the renewable energy case, but I think it is difficult to close doors because the world is evolving, and if we see the way the climate policies are coming about and regulations are following up on policy, those are very, very long processes. So this would not be good, basically, to take as a basis for, already now jumping to one solution or another. I think you need to have different solutions available. But what is more important than an individual technology, and I think that's what Jeffrey also alluded to, is to plan out the systems properly. So now with the COP21, each country needs to make a plan, which is called the nationally determined contribution, that the country may wish to put forward in terms of how each country will achieve certain emissions reductions. Okay. There's a timeline associated with it. Obviously, if all countries in the world put one plan forward, and that is to go 100% renewable, that would be not necessarily the most optimal solution to this problem. So I think different countries, they have different opportunities to bring about CO2 reductions. If we look at Qatar, for example, 90% of the CO2 emission sits within the industry sector, and it is stationary CO2. Most of it has already been purified, or to a large extent it's almost pure as part of the industrial processing. So you have many options that are way lower cost per ton of CO2 cut compared to renewable energy put into the power sector. And I think all of the solutions need to be taken into consideration, and then there should be a plan that works best for each country. And across countries, obviously, it would be good also to have some collaboration to explore solutions together. There are different countries with different profiles. Obviously, the more heterogeneous the system is, the more you can create synergies. So there can be a lot of benefits through cross-border interactions between countries, like hydrocarbon exporters, hydrocarbon importers, and that should lead to even more economically attractive plans with bilateral agreements or multilateral agreements underpinned. Now, unfortunately, I'm a researcher myself, but in that space of policy making, there is very little research going on. A lot of the research has already embedded the technological solution in it, rather than has an open mind for basically assembling solutions that can lead to low carbon futures with a local focus. And this would have to be interdisciplinary. I think engineers, economists, social scientists have to work much closer together to come up with plans that would really work and would also help to find the balance between costs as well as economic development. Now, one last point on employment generation. Since I was in charge for some time planning this renewable energy-based system, and in Qatar, you don't want to create jobs, you want to avoid jobs. We looked a little bit into the employment associated with renewable energy, and there's not so much value added. A lot of the employment is really in the installations. There's not a lot of employment long-term that can give you a very high standard of living in the operations of these facilities. So I think there needs to be a much more sophisticated thinking behind economic development in a low-carbon future. It's not just a matter of putting in alternative energy. You have to revamp the economy in more sophisticated ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, but we will not let you go that easily without a small token of our appreciation. So Mr. Hussam Abu Issam will be presenting you with a small gift of our appreciation.
It's for having to leave early, but I have to catch my flight, really.
You want your gift or not?
It will just take a minute. Just a minute. I'll take a minute.
Okay.
She will take it. By the way, we don't save jobs. We are upgrading quality of jobs. There's a difference in Qatar.
Exactly. And I've experienced it. Thank you.
Now we have Mr. Marwan Khraisheh. He is the Executive Director, Qatar Environment, and Senior Research Director, Energy Research Institute of Qatar.
Okay. Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the organizers for this event, and also I would like to thank the Abdullah bin Hamad Al Atiyah Foundation for inviting me and for really making energy an important theme in this event. The foundation has been really organizing a number of roundtables and seminars. So it's great to see the discussion extending and reaching out to Istanbul here. Talking about renewable energy, I think we've seen a number of discussions and some sort of a very good competition between the different sources. I think the approach should be is that we, as a global, community, we need to get as much as we can of energy sources because we need a lot of it. Okay, as the population growth, the lifestyle changes, and we will have a significant demand for energy. So I think the formula should be is how to diversify the mix of energy sources. I think that is very important. So I believe a sound national energy strategy would be twofold. The first fold is a portfolio of energy sources. So you have to bring a mix of energy sources, not just one or two entities. As well, I think we talked about renewable energy, but I think it has to go hand in hand with energy efficiency and demand side management. I think it's as critical as introducing or developing additional renewable energy sources there. So my colleagues talked about motivation for renewable energy. I think We all know about them. Climate change, we're talking about energy security, access to energy, especially for people with rural areas. So all of these are important. But I think one important one, and my colleague mentioned, which is also the social and economic development as well. Okay, so I think this provides to some nations a great opportunity for additional jobs, employment, and also improving the welfare of people there. I want to take the discussion a little bit towards my specialty, which is more on R&D and innovation. I think what we need is to advance renewable energy further and introduce additional sources of renewable energy is we really need to focus on innovation. It's very critical that we focus on innovation to advance it and also solve some of the problems and shortcomings that comes with renewable energy or alternative energy in general. And when we talk about innovation, sometimes we limit our discussion to just technological innovation. And I think definitely we need technological innovations. We need new technologies that will reduce the cost and increase efficiency of the different sources. But I think as important, we need to look at policy innovation. We really have to introduce policies and regulations that are innovative, that will allow the deployment and facilitation of utilization of renewable energy. We also need to look at innovation in the business model. We can't just apply the existing business model for energy systems to renewable energy. There is definitely larger risk involved in renewable energy, and I think if we want to advance this, we have really to share the risk among the different players in the system there. And also, I think, which is very important, we have to look at system innovation. So, there are some advances on pure components, technological components, but I think introducing innovation at the system level will definitely bring more benefits to the equation here. And key to all of this is R&D. And I think we really have to invest in research and development. This is what we are doing in Qatar. And, Qatar is positioning itself as a leader in the region, as a higher education and research intensive country. We have a number of universities that are advancing higher education and incorporating in energy, renewable energy sustainability at the core of its curriculum. Also, there is heavy investment in research and development focused on, again, sustainable energy, on renewable energy, water security, and environmental sustainability as well. And we at the Institute within Qatar Foundation, Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute, we are a mission-driven research institute that is addressing energy security and water security issues that are of great importance locally, of course, to Qatar, but also they have global outreach. We are developing technologies that can be not only applied in Qatar, but can also be applied elsewhere. If I want to just give a couple of examples on some of the research areas that we are focusing on. One of the areas we're looking at is introducing renewable energy, specifically solar PV, whether on the grid or off the grid there. And we're doing research at different levels. We're doing research at the material level as well as all the way to the module level. But the very specific issues we are addressing is the performance and reliability and durability of solar PV in a desert-like environment. And this is a very critical issue if you want to advance solar energy not only in the GCC or in Qatar, but also outside. The temperature effect and the dusting, the soiling effect on the performance of solar energy is significant and needs technological advances to solve some of these problems. So that's some of the focus we are doing, is we're trying to understand how do we design solar cells and design related technologies that will allow us to address the temperature issues as well as the dusting and soiling issues in Qatar. That is also very important because right now Qatar is going through a blockade, and that is actually turning into a very positive thing for the country as they are focusing on being more self-reliant, more self-dependent. And one of the issues we need to address there is the food security program. And food security is heavily dependent on energy and water. So there are a number of farms in Qatar that are producing electricity and also dealing with livestock. That number will increase. That's the national direction. And for that, you need to provide electricity and water. Of course, there are enough power plants that they can produce electricity, but introducing, for example, solar energy for farms that are off the grid is a very attractive solution to not use diesel generators. So that's be good for the environment, but also it will be creating a new sector there that hopefully will grow businesses as well and support the National Food Security Program. So, I just wanted to say that it's not this or, I think it's this and. We need all sources of energy. And someone told me, and I like to use this example, when we moved from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, we didn't move because the bronze has vanished from the world. We still have bronze, but at a stage you have a new commodity that becomes more strategic than the existing commodity. So if fossil fuel have been very strategic over the last decades and probably will continue for the next few, well, we have to think of maybe a new commodity that will be more strategic, and then we have to that. So I think the visionary leadership that look at diversifying the economy, diversifying the energy sources is really what we are doing in Qatar right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you will be continuing with the next panel.
Do we still have time for...
Do we have time for questions, answers?
Yeah, questions and also debate within the panel, if that's okay. I mean, you've made a great point about innovation and research and development, which I think we should really talk a bit more about. If we have maybe another 5-10 minutes or something?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah? We would try to be very quick, so...
Okay.
Apparently we're allowed to speak. Does anyone have a question, or can I just make a remark on... Please, sir.
What we require mostly is to create a solid policy, and this policy is to be able to be sustainable regardless of the changes. We have different policies and keep on changing different changes of the management. We have to create a national policy to find a way how to implement the national policy regardless of the changes. There's tactical changes and there's major changes. It has to be technical change, but the policy must be fixed to, addressed, and really continue with it for a long time. Otherwise, all what we talk about, renewable energy, etc., is not going to work. We're going to keep on changing our minds. So a real policy must be created by the government to be implemented by government subsidiaries and by the private sector as well. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely essential, and I think that's not just the case of the GCC or the Middle East, but across the globe. A lot of countries are suffering by inconsistent or poorly applied regulatory frameworks. And that policy or regulatory framework are interchangeable in this context here. And it is quite clear in our experience that you need a proper, thought-out, business-friendly and consistent, use the right word, consistency is key for business policy around renewable energy or mix of energy or having this alternative energy. And I think the difficulty is that a lot of these countries are doing this in isolation and not looking at the best practices that are emerging from the world. We have leading examples, both from the region as well as outside the region, of how to do things. But for some reason, each time a government wants to do a renewable energy plan or a renewable program, it starts from scratch. It starts from a blank piece of paper, when there should be no reason for doing that. And actually, Turkey is a very good example of how things have been done and have been done very well. And if you allow me, I'll use the example of geothermal energy. Now, for those that don't know, geothermal energy is a renewable source of energy using the water and the heat coming up from the soil. And geothermal has been in existence in Turkey since the 1970s. Between 1970 and 2010, there was 100 megawatts of geothermal installed in Turkey. 40 years. Now, 100 megawatts, for those that are not in the energy space, is nothing. It's absolutely minimal. Now, a few years ago, the Turkish government really decided to promote renewable energy and geothermal specifically. And then it put in place a very friendly business framework with a lot of support from international organizations such as the World Bank, EBRD, as well as local banks. And within 2 to 3 years, there has been 1,000 megawatts of geothermal installed in Turkey. Now that's 10 times more in about 10 times less time. That's how incredible, just by doing one thing, which is a piece of paper and publishing in the official journal. That's all they've done, realistically. And if we use that as an example, and I'm not saying the geothermal law of Turkey is the best in the world, not necessarily, but we use that as the footprint and as an example of how things can be done and get inspired by that. I think a lot of countries can learn by what Turkey has done. And geothermal today in Turkey is a leading and shining example of that. It's such a great example that today Turkey has reached the number 5 geothermal country in the world. That's incredible. So you have America, Philippines, Indonesia, who have much bigger resources than Turkey. And by 2020, it is expected to be number 2 in the world, because there's about another 3 or 4 gigawatts, so 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts, that will be installed by 2020, so over the next 3 years or so.
Just want to comment on the policy. I totally agree with you that without policy, and I think that's what I said, it's one important component to advance renewable energy. Because we're doing research in Qatar about renewable energy, I just want to say that in Vision 2030, which was rolled out more than 10 years ago, a very clear pillar is environmental sustainability. So the government has been very consistent in growing with an important pillar, which is environmental sustainability. And that has translated into their 5-year national development strategies. We actually completed one in 16, 17, and we're working on the next 5 years. And it's very important that its environmental sustainability is there, and it's very clear. Now the QB, Qatar Petroleum, and Qatar Electricity and Water Company have developed or created a joint venture to start the first large 500 megawatt PV plant. The land has been already identified, and they're doing studies right now on that. So there is a clear plan for it. I agree with you, consistency is very important, but I think the National Vision 2030 is on track, and part of that is environmental sustainability. The same thing when we talk about COP21, Qatar is a signatory of that, and they're working on their nationally determined practices as well for that.
If I can pick up one more comment as well, we discussed the importance of innovation. That's absolutely true, and I think there are opportunities to combine the purpose of renewable energy generation with other purposes. So, for example, I'm developing a project right now looking at plants that remediate soil. So plants, you can grow crops, they take contaminants out of the ground, then you can use those plants for bioenergy and decontaminate the resulting exhaust. So there are ways to combine a remediation concept with a bioenergy concept. Similarly with solar photovoltaic. In London, there are big reservoirs for water. They've put floating panels on top of the reservoir, which reduces evaporation from the reservoir and also keeps the solar panels cooler and at a higher operational efficiency because they're next to the water. So there are ways to, I think, combine uses to make renewable energy even more impressive, bring costs down, and achieve multiple outcomes beyond just the myriad of benefits that I believe renewables carry with them. I think, though, that we have to be realistic in terms of the scale of the challenge and the speed with which we need to decarbonize our energy system and our entire global economy. That's an enormous challenge. Innovation is important. Innovation delivers results often 5 or 10 years down the road, and we don't have 5 or 10 years to wait to turn the shape of the emissions curve around. I am doing some consulting for National Grid right now, and absolutely innovation is top of the importance list, but that is to innovate around integrating more renewables into the grid, developing electric vehicle to grid solutions so you can have distributed storage and manage the inconsistencies of renewables. Innovation is important, but we really, guys, need to be building more renewables and shutting down as many coal plants as we can, as fast as we can. There's no room left in the atmosphere for this amount of carbon. And I think it can feel uncomfortable to recognize that everything we've done for the last since the Industrial Revolution now has to try and be unpicked and undone. And there are many solutions that we're going to have to adopt, many different policy approaches that we need to develop. But the fact remains, we need to keep most of the fossil fuels that we've developed in the ground if we're going to have a chance of hitting our carbon reduction goals and you know, have a habitable planet in the medium term. So I think that really should be our focus. We need to look at the goal and work backwards from where we need to be rather than looking at where we are today and trying to figure out how to get to the goal. Let's project manage this a little bit as well, you know. That's my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to add a couple things. In Turkey, in order to develop a geothermal power plant, we have to get permission from 27 different government authorities. And despite the fact that there is still red tape and bureaucracy, within the past 4 years, just like you mentioned, we basically had close to 900 megawatts of geothermal power plants. So this shows that if we keep our minds open, and on another note, geothermal energy is not as clean as we think. It is producing carbon dioxide that is close to a coal power plant. And also the NCGs that are coming out from underground that are really dangerous. So further technology and further enhancement, and I believe that in the near future, within the next, if they extend the feed-in tariff to 2025, because right now the power plants that are being built until the 2020 are eligible for the feed-in tariffs. But if they extend it, I believe that we are going to double that force with new technology as well. So coming to your question, sir, yes, the policies and the regulations, what we did in our power plants were, we looked at Philippines. Because their law doesn't change. The governments come and go, but the law is still the same for the past 60 years. So that would be a good example to take a look into. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Hüsam Abuissa, Vice President of Salam International and Member of Honorary Board of ICP, to deliver the awards. Ladies first, of course. That's all? Okay. Miss Özlem. Thanks to all speakers. Thank you so much.